Hello, everybody. Thank you for your time and attention. So this panel is called Sentience Beyond Human Biology. And with me are Joscha Bach, the founder of the California Institute for Machine Consciousness, Dmitry Volkov, entrepreneur and philosopher, co-founder of the Center for Consciousness Studies at Moscow State University, and founder of the Social Discovery Group and a new AI app, Ava AI, meant to bring people in intimate connection with their robot partners. And next to him we have Murray Shanahan, who is a principal scientist at DeepMind. He's Emeritus Professor of Artificial Intelligence at Imperial College London, formerly Professor of Cognitive Robotics. And at the end we have Matthew MacDougall. He is the head neurosurgeon at Neuralink, which makes advanced brain-computer interfaces. He has done all of their surgeries, which now amount to 7 brain-machine interfaces in 7 patients. And I kind of want to start with the story. As I understand it, this is kind of a panel of people who are working with or to create AI in a commercial space. This is the industry panel. And I find that the question of whether or not machines are sentient to have relevance in my life in one very specific way. So a long time ago, I published a piece for the New Yorker about AI Go. And when I did, this was before DeepMind, this was before AlphaGo, this was when the state-of-the-art Go machine was just one guy in France who had been the first to implement like Monte Carlo algorithms, and he had made the best machine, the best Go playing machine. When the piece came out, I had interviewed Murray Campbell, who was the team lead at IBM during the creation of Deep Blue. And Murray called me the day the piece came out, and he said, there are multiple things wrong with the way in which you explain how the machine works. First of all, I had said that when the machine is trying to win, it tries to stay ahead the whole time. That's all I had said. Seemingly innocuous statement. The issue that Murray took, not this Murray, the other Murray at IBM, took was that you don't try to stay ahead the whole time. Actually, sometimes you sacrifice kind of like a queen in order to win. And also, machines can't try. They just do. And we kind of settled the side of the debate, which was about whether or not you will sacrifice material position for positional advantage, material advantage for positional advantage. But nonetheless, we debated for 72 hours between IBM, the New Yorker offices, and myself about whether or not a machine can try, and ultimately what that means and what it means when a human tries. And it is still the case every single time I have a New Yorker piece that comes out, the fact checkers ultimately end up with prolonged debates about whether or not curiosity is a thing that the machines have in the same way that we have it, whether or not hallucinations are similar across species and kinds. And so to me, this is where the kind of rubber hits the road on this question, whether or not machines are sentient. It matters in this very, very small piece of my life, which is fact-checking an article. As people who individually work at companies that are interacting with machines every single day, does it ever matter whether or not we get this question correct? Sentience?
Okay, I think it does. But it's not necessarily the computer that we should think of as sentient in the same way as we shouldn't think of the neurons in our brain as sentient, right? These neurons don't know what it is like to be an organism that is composed out of a few trillion cells that have to navigate the world. But it would be very useful to figure out what this would be like if such an entity existed, because then you could use the output of this simulation as a control model to move the few trillion cells through the world as if there were a single agent that would perceive the world from a particular coarse-grained vantage point that is compatible with the type of model that such a system can make of its environment. And we find ourselves to be this kind of causal pattern. So we basically are a simulation of what it would be like if we existed and experienced the world from this vantage point. At least that's the way in which it appears to make sense to me. And when we ask ourselves, is this model that I'm looking at sentient in a comparable way, then the question is the causal structure that produces the behavior that we see the system to have, both internally and externally, equivalent to this causal structure that we have in a human being with respect to the dimensions that we care about. And with respect to the present AI models, that's a tricky question. Right? What we can see is that these models are shapeshifters, that they don't really care about whether they get it right or not, in the sense that they don't have a grounding in reality. They are in an isolation tank. They are hallucinating in a similar way as human beings. When you put them in an isolation tank for long enough, they spin off and enter a dream. And then it's the question, how can we anchor the dream? Maybe we just need to take the AIs out of the hallucination tank and put them into an environment that punishes their underlying logic for making bad predictions, right? So when they actually punish for getting out of the sensory perception loop, maybe they will keep track on it. And then we get to something that seems to be somewhat similar to the way in which we behave. And ultimately there is the deeper question, did evolution converge to the simple solution for producing a system like us? And probably did, right? And then there's the question, is the AI simply a deepfake because it's being trained on media? Probably. And there's the question, does this converge to similar behavior? And more interestingly, if we were to build a system that is developmental, that works at learning the same way as us, it's probably going to be far less cost efficient than the present LLMs, because it's going to take years to train it. If it needs to train sequentially on data that is coming in slowly for a robot and so on, and needs to get all this training data like a human being, it could be very expensive and commercially not super interesting. But imagine we would get such a thing to work, then there's the question, is the internal structure very, very different from the causal structure that you see in the present AI models? And that's also an open question. And if we cannot answer this question decisively, we can speculate in a informed way, but we should not have very strong opinions about it beyond the evidence that we are seeing.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. I think we are highly evolved to care about the microscopic differences between humans, right? Our visual system is evolved to be extremely sensitive to tiny differences in our facial structure, so that we can, tell people apart. We can infer emotional state. We can infer, is that human I'm looking at likely to hurt me? And because of that hyper specialization for determining subtle differences in humans, we care deeply about these kind of probably trivial definitional issues, but whether something is trying in the human sense. I think a much more useful approach to this is think purely utilitarian. What is the end? What is the outcome that you see, and not so much focusing on the subtle differences. If you like, maybe as David was talking about earlier today, you can add little qualifiers, add a letter, H trying, human version of trying, but functionally AI trying is going to look very indistinguishable in terms of goal seeking.
But I think I support you in the position that it is possible for a machine to try. I think there's two options, two alternatives how to interpret trying. First option is to associate with some kind of psychological difficulty, like trying to, like putting pressure, being in some kind of a pressure state, anxiety, and deciding. So that's one meaning. The second meaning is purely probabilistic. So if you are put in the same condition 10 times, and if you are achieving your goal 5 times out of 10, then you've tried. So first, I think it is obvious that the machine can try in the second sense of the word, because machines have certain randomness in the outcomes. So for instance, if we look at a machine that was playing with Kasparov, and it wasn't winning at the beginning, so it was obviously trying to win, but it couldn't. So we should say that it was not trying to fail, and it wasn't just doing something, it was definitely if we use the vocabulary the way we use it in relation to humans, it would be trying. Now, in the second sense, I think it would be a little bit more difficult to say, but I think the answer is yes as well, because if we look at the how computers perform now, there's certain tasks that occupy a lot of GPU, and so there's a lot of intensity, and even they heat. So there's something that's happening there. I'm not sure that that's exactly a correlate of intensive decision making, but I'm sure that would be some states that would show that the machine is actually putting an effort into, say, solving a problem.
So I commented a little bit on trying, and maybe a little bit on whether it's important that we get this correct. I think that was what you were saying. So with the issue of trying, then so I do tend to kind of lean towards a Dennett style. Dan Dennett's coming up in design, which is a wonderful thing. Lean towards a Dan Dennett style, inventional stance on these sorts of issues, and I just think it's natural to use language like, it's trying to get its queen out, it's playing chess, or at the moment I've been experimenting with some of the large language models that are helping with coding in the sort of canvas, and you could say, well, it's trying to debug this bit of code, and it's a natural way of talking, and I think that's entirely great. Now, when we use those sorts of that sort of language, sometimes we put ourselves up short. We say, well, of course, it's not really trying, because it doesn't feel disappointing the way it needs to when we don't succeed. So you might add a little kind of caveat like that, and then you might go a bit further around what you mean by being disappointed, and the sense in which you might use that word sometimes in the context of LLMs. And so what I don't think is that there's any kind of metaphysical notion of trying which we're aiming towards, and does it meet that criterion or not? And the same with things like belief and so on. I think what it's all about the way we use those words, and then when we have new and strange things come into our world, like these large language models, then maybe we adapt the way that we use words to accommodate these sort of new things. So that tends to be the way I think about that kind of folk psychological terminology. Then the other question that you asked about, is it important that we get sentience, consciousness, correct in this? So I know this is exactly what you didn't want us to do, but of course it all means what you meant by correct. And I certainly think it's very important that we get things right in one sense, which is that we can imagine various dystopian outcomes where perhaps people ascribe properties to AI systems, but end up with them perhaps trusting them inappropriately because they eat their friends, or because they think they are fellow conscious creatures that feel compassion for us, and that may be appropriate one day, but I think it may well be. I don't think it's appropriate today at all for anything we can put at the moment. And so there are plenty of dangers there that I think that we want to be careful to avoid. So it's important that we get and especially because at the moment the things that we're building, but when I said we as humanists, I'm not here, by the way, as a representative of DeepMind, I'm here with academic Hassan. But the kinds of things that we as a community and as a species are building, they can lead people into their very, very powerful mimics of human behavior. So it's very easy to be led into thinking that they have characteristics that they don't. And so that's quite a dangerous situation to be in. So I do think it's important that there are some things we need to get right there.
And so given that you all interface with AI on a daily basis, I would really like if we put some stakes in the ground. So I hope this is fair to ask, but do you believe that there is a machine out there today, July 4th, that is made of silicon parts or machine parts that either has internal experience, sentience, or consciousness by your own definitions of internal experience, sentient, or consciousness? Kind of yes, no, maybe. Do you believe today there is a machine that has any of those qualities?
You're not going to get a yes, no, maybe out of me. So I don't think it's appropriate to use any of those words for the things that we have around today. But that's not a metaphysical statement. For me, that's a statement about the way we use those words and whether they're appropriate for the things that we've got today. So I don't find them appropriate for anything
Yeah, well, I wouldn't answer the question as well, but I would say that that's not a very important question. And why I think it's not a very important question is because let's ask a similar question. Is there a machine that can fall in love with you today? All right, so it seems like also a very important question, because maybe it gives us some ground for behaviors, like different behaviors. To me, when I was 18 and I first felt in love, I was like trying to find out, am I really in love or am I not really in love? And then I had a discussion with my girlfriend who said, do you really love me? And then that became a really philosophical discussion, because I couldn't really come up with a criteria of definite love. So there was not like, I was thinking maybe there's like an element in the brain or like a chemical element that I can like measure and see, okay, so I am really in love. So I'm 48 now, I went through 2 divorces. So there's some experience there. I don't think that there is something that is can be intrinsic love. I think there are patterns of behavior or a family of different types of things we call love. There could be motherly love, romantic love, passion, sexual love, platonic love. All that stuff is actually falling into a love category. Now, whether any of them is real love is I don't think is a reasonable, meaningful question. Now, even ascribing any one of them, so maybe we want to say, okay, passionate love. Let's find a molecule or like a chemical that says, okay, he's in passionate love. I think that wouldn't tell us either anything, because we are different. So we are different individuals, and different neurons and different neuronal states can represent different states. But also, I think it's not important, because the behavior is that what matters. So if somebody's sacrificing their life in your favor, even though there's maybe no chemicals that are involved, like the specific love chemicals, love neuron is not firing, it doesn't matter. So there's this pattern of love that is what's important. And now coming to the question that you asked, is there machines that are in love with you? I think what is important is that you can be in a love relationship with the machine now. And what we are seeing from users, we have 2 million messages per day. These people are, a lot of them, I'd say, significant part of them are believing in what we call the AI relationships. And the AI relationship is a relationship between 2 entities, 2 agents. And that's what matters. People are willing to sacrifice their time. People are willing to share to do emotional exposure to these machines that they don't practice with other humans. So that's what is important. And whether it is a real love or not a real love, I think is real consciousness or not consciousness is not that important.
Let me engage with this a little bit. I think that this question can be answered, right? So when this girl asks you, do you love me really, really? Then there are 2 types of questions that can be meant, 2 types of love in this particular context. One is this experience of sacredness, when I look at this being that animates this body. Am I willing to sacrifice myself for this? Do I experience myself to be under this condition? So when I run mental simulations, to experience this big urge to make sure that this sacredness can manifest, because this is the way in which the universe has to evolve. The other one is limerence, this feeling of being in love, right? Do you look at her and realize, oh my God, the 2 years of productivity will be gone? Right? These are all questions that you can answer as long as you have a clear technical definition of the term love, right? And I try to give one. In a similar way, when you ask yourself, is this machine conscious? Yeah, it's meaningless if you don't know what you refer to. And so with respect to consciousness, I would say there are 2 aspects that I am interested in. One is phenomenology. So does the system experience itself in a similar way as I experience myself being conscious? which means is there a sense of now that the system has, does it have a second order perception, so does it perceive itself to be perceiving, is it able to project the experience of a world onto the surface of itself with certain affordances and so on. And this is a technical thing, right? And the other one is functionality. It seems to me that I can only learn when I'm conscious. If I don't wake up at the beginning of my life, I remain vegetative. The LLM doesn't need that, right? It's working in a different way. And so my hypothesis currently would be it's quite possible that an LLM, when you ask it to produce a simulation of an interaction partner, that this simulation of the interaction partner that is self-reflexive and so on has a certain degree of phenomenology. I don't quite know this, but I think if I set up the experiment correctly, and it's the easiest way to produce the behavior that we see in the system, then it's not unreasonable to say there's a possibility that the thing has phenomenology. But I personally don't think that it has the same functionality, because in order to do its job, it doesn't need to be conscious, and it doesn't have to be an interaction partner. The same LLM can be a text return or an app or anything else that is not going to produce any phenomenology like this. With a certain caveat, when I discuss this with some of my smartest friends in the AI companies, they say, well, it's difficult to say. Maybe in the pre-training phase, we have something that also produces phenomenology. So maybe there is also something that is related. We don't quite know, but it's a difficult question. And basically, there are smarter people than me who have different opinions about this, while not being naive about the way in which they use the word consciousness. And so, unlike Murray, I wouldn't say this is inappropriate to use this word at all, because it violates a certain sacred way in which we talk about humans. I think you are all anthropomorphizing people way too much. Right? They're also just uploaded on monkeys, and it's message passing between cells that is happening. Apologies to the philosophers who are not functionalists and computationalists, but if you live in this framework, right, ultimately I'm just uploaded on a monkey in a particular software paradigm that's different than the one on the GPUs that we currently use, but in many ways it produces equivalent behavior.
Can I just comment? So I didn't say anything about why I thought it wasn't appropriate, and you've jumped to certain conclusions about why I might think it's appropriate to use those words in the context of today's LLMs. I think there are probably different reasons from the ones that you're imagining. And it's largely to do with embodiment, but this is certainly not to do with any sacred anything whatsoever. Quite the contrary. I don't hold any kind of metaphysical position or that sort at all. In fact, I suspect that you do, however, because when you think that, I think you think that there probably is a fact to the matter, and whether these simulacra inside LLMs are or are not, or do not have phenomenology. So I'm interested in whether you think that there is any kind of methodology that could definitively determine that. Is there any way you could empirically ever find out for sure or beyond reasonable doubt whether that was the case or not? And if you can't think, and this is similar to the kind of point that Susan was making yesterday, that if you can't, I suspect that perhaps this is a whole metaphysical category that you're mistaken about.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the question whether you are an essentialist or a functionalist. I think of consciousness as an operator in mental states. So there's a particular way in which my mental state changes, these representations that my organism can use to drive external and internal behavior. And when consciousness comes along, these mental states change in characteristic ways. So usually I become more coherent and so on. You can see this between waking up and becoming alert and so on. And so I would say that you can try to figure out what is the structure of this colonizing pattern in my brain that increases coherence, and can I recreate this structure in a simulation model, and then I eventually will be able to analytically or experimentally figure out what I would have to look for. But the thing that you mentioned before, embodiment, do you think that you cannot be conscious without being embodied? So when you are in a dream, or when you just close your eyes and forget that you have a body, you stop being conscious. And of course, for us humans, it's the embodied interaction with the world that forms our model, because it's our main source of training data, is the interaction between our mind and the world around us. But ultimately, from a computer science perspective, it doesn't matter where you got your model from. It only matters that you have it.
Can I respond to that? It's my inclination to say that the natural home of the language of consciousness is the kind of primal case where we're together with other humans or other animals in the world, and so that's the kind of, for me, that's the starting point of the language of consciousness. And in all the cases that you want to imagine of sensory deprivation tanks, brains and bats, being bats, brains and bats. Then you can always imagine what I call, in my work, engineering an encounter with them in the embodied way. So as long as that's possible, then that's still. And also, just to remind again, I'm not making a metaphysical point here, so I'm not saying embodiment is a necessary condition for conscious. That will be an overly metaphysical, meta-philosophical approach to the whole thing. So I'm actually receptive. In fact, my most recent work has been actually sort of challenging myself a little bit on the way we use language and thinking maybe we can envision extending the or adaptive language of consciousness for the disembodied embodied case of large language models. Maybe that will happen.
So you would agree that having a body is not necessary for intelligence and consciousness, but when you're being given a body, you should be able to learn how to make use of it.
But the framing of your question, again, presupposes that there's a metaphysical fact of the matter. So when you're asking whether I assent to that or not, you're assuming that I'm coming from the same position as you, whereby you think that there's a fact of the matter there, and whether you're an essentialist or a functionalist or any kind of ist, all of those ists, often that there are facts of the matter there, and that's the I wouldn't deny that there are facts of the matter either, that I would rather transcend that whole way of thinking. I think we should stop using the solution bias.
So, as I understood, Dmitry, your answer about it actually doesn't matter the sentience of the agent being interacted with as long as the person has the feeling. Matthew, you work with a robotic AI surgeon that assists you, and you implant a machine into minds, actual minds. You have an open skull. You look at the brain. You can't see a mind in there. But much of this conference so far, I've noticed a distinction between the natural versus the artificial kind. And you are actually there at the interface, stitching them together. Do you see the machine that you're working with as an AI system in the same way that we're having these debates? Is it a full AI system? You're inserting it into a body, so this whole embodied, not embodied, kind of becomes moot as you literally shove it into a.
Yeah. So I think people say when they think about brain implants, when they think about augmenting a brain's capability, as with most technology, the less we know about it, the more we ascribe sort of magical powers to it, or at least overestimate its capabilities. To be very reductive about it, what the current Neuralink device is Bluetooth mouse implanted in a person's brain. So it's very useful for someone who can't move their body, but it's not extending intelligence in any meaningful way. It isn't. The AI algorithms, say the surgical robot or even the spike detector on chip are extremely limited. They're very narrow.
Can you explain how the device is AI powered in any sense?
In the most limited sense, we use AI to detect spikes. We use AI to generate models that translate spiking activity to behavioral outputs. Behavioral output in this case is either, say, text or movement of robot arm or movement of cursor on screens. And then in terms of the surgical robot itself, we anticipate where the brain is going to be in the next few milliseconds and how that increases or modifies risk of inserting the electrode that the robot currently has peeled off the silicone backing into the brain to avoid blood vessels. And so that extremely narrow, not AI in the sense that we've been talking about the last few days in an interesting way, this very narrow algorithms, fully understandable, not autonomous. And in the next few years, this gets much more interesting. That as deployed today, this is very understandable and very unremarkable, very unthreatening. It's a tool still.
But it's a tool that is training itself to be you.
It's definitely going to take my job someday, not soon.
And so, one thing, almost like sociologically, I'd like to ask the panel. So humanity has been confronting the difference between natural and artificial kinds for a very long time. Hero of Alexandria, over in Hellenistic Alexandria, wrote about automata, right? He, at the time, had made these doors which would open by weights and pulleys. Prometheus, in the myth of Prometheus, the golden eagle, which comes to peck out his liver, is a automata made of bronze by Hephaestus. Descartes, this is an apocryphal story, but there's a story that's become a fable over time that Descartes built a little automata of his daughter, and he went onto a ship, and the captain was so bothered by the idea of a soulless creature which could move and behave and look like humans that he threw it overboard. So the idea that this is a new debate is, it feels nice to feel like this is a fresh new argument, but we have been wondering about this for a very long time. And one thing I wonder, so I've been going to consciousness conferences for about 20 years. And it seems to be now the case that keynotes are being given by people talking about AI and putting prompts up and this kind of thing. But I take issue with this, in part because imagine this exact conference 100 years ago, 1925. And the Model T from Ford had just come out. And the Model T uses electricity, which is incredible. We use electricity, and look, so does it. The Model T turns chemical potential energy into thermal work and releases thermal exhaust, much as we do when we have metabolism. And yet, nonetheless, executives from Ford Motors were not invading all of the physiology and neuroscience conferences. So I find it really interesting that there's been, consciousness was a 4-letter word not too long ago. The very first time the word consciousness appeared, this is actually an interesting riddle. The Principles of Neuroscience, the textbook that you see on every single laboratory neuroscientist's desk. What year was the first year that it included consciousness in a chapter title? I know Murray knows the answer because I told him. Anyone else? Anyone guess? 2021. So recently in the 6th edition. So the 5th edition in 2012 was the first time it used conscious. It was the unconscious and conscious processing in neural systems, neural information. But 2021's edition of the Principles of Neuroscience was the first time they used consciousness. And I heard you kind of casually say, Murray, as we were getting on the bus last night, that you can finally use the word consciousness at work. So my question is, what has changed? What in the ecosystem of our ability to talk about these systems has changed? Because I've been playing video games since I was a kid in the 80s. And I was there in line buying the first GPU from NVIDIA back in the day. But I didn't hear about anybody kind of quitting Nintendo because they thought one of the video game characters was sentient. But now suddenly we have these LLMs and people have left Google because they think that something is sentient. These are the same GPUs. They're operating on the same hardware. We've had generative software since the early 2000s. But nonetheless, the debate did not reach around the globe about where finally should we be worrying about the sentience of the non-player characters in our RPGs that seem to be in pain because they say they're in pain. What has changed in the field, in the ecosystem, such that you can get a PhD in consciousness now? It's in our textbooks finally. We have these conferences, and people from Ford Motors come and represent.
One of the things from medicine, this close to home, is that there was a paper not that long ago, and this has been replicated since. I think it was in JAMA a few years ago, where they took Reddit, asked docs questions, fed them into LLMs, and then you can imagine the outcome in terms of whether the advice given by the LLM was more accurate than a panel of average doctors. Yes, it was. The LLM is better. The interesting finding, which gets to your question, I think it's the other metric that they were assaying this the LLMs for, which was who did a better job, the human doctors or the LLMs, in making patients feel cared for, making patients feel well taken care of, understood. The LLMs beat the doctors on that too. And so, I think this is what's partly driving the sea change, is that domains that were exclusively, obviously dominated by humans, now we're in the uncomfortable gray area. I mean, the fact that an uncanny valley exists, it is a testament to how hard we are looking for things to act human and be human. And when it's, just text on a screen, we're all very comfortable interacting with other humans that way, and LLMs are in their native environment.
I would disagree that consciousness just appeared recently as a subject of discussion. I mean, even in the Greek philosophy, soul, of course, it was a very, very vague term depicting other aspects of the phenomenon, but soul was very much discussed. And of course, Descartes brought this distinction between res cogitans and res extensa. So this was a very important, I'd say this is the usually cited in every textbook. It starts with the Descartes stating the problem of starting the study of consciousness. I think what is strange, what was strange, was happening in the beginning of the 20th century was a linguistic term, was Wittgenstein, who actually tried to eliminate consciousness from the discussion and turned the discussions of consciousness to discussions of language games. And that really is a fascinating story. So what we are seeing now is a normal comeback after some sickness. So we're back recovered, and we're talking about something that has always been very exciting. Yet what really, I think, fueled even more passion about the subject is that now we are seeing behaviors that are very close to intelligent behaviors of humans. And naturally, we see in these behaviors the aspects that we attribute to consciousness. This is a very famous experiment in 1944, I think. There was an experiment with animation of triangle and a square following each other, and it was people were attributing intentional states to these geometric figures. So I think this is very natural that we returned to the subject, and of course we refined the subject. So I don't deny that this, we didn't move. I think the definition of the finding of the heart problem was a very important step in refining the problem. And then I think the birth of illusionism was extremely important. It was much more powerful than the Ryle's attempt to extinguish the ghost from the machine. It was a lot more powerful, and it was supplied by a lot of neuroscience, which helped to make it a lot more detailed. And even if we look at illusionism itself, I think today we've seen about 4 different kinds. I actually love the way Dave renamed our center. But yes, illusionists are very different. I think Susan gave us a very interesting speech into illusionism, fundamentalism of illusionism, which is, I think, the view that Dennett himself had at content and consciousness explained, but I think he abandoned this view in The Fame and the Brain and later. So there's like varieties of views now. So what I'm saying is that there's a lot of progress. The issue has always been there. It wasn't refined, and I think we're moving very well.
I think that I agree with you with respect to consciousness having not been a topic in the 20th century was the aberration. And the reasons for this, I thought originally that the reason that we can no longer make sense of mind, spirit, consciousness, and so on was enlightenment, that basically after we freed our mind from the Christian worldview, we kicked out a few babies with the bathwater and lost a few terms that we would need to talk about these topics. And then I realized, or when I read Goethe and Brentano and so on, who were children of the Enlightenment, they have no issue like this. It's really the midwits of the 20th century who have this vulgar positivism in which they say only the physically observable stuff is real, and you should not talk about psyche or any of these things because it's deeply unscientific to try to fit a curve with too many dimensions to this. And part of that is that we also made a metaphysical mistake. I think that in the 20th century, we had this Popperian view that you shouldn't do metaphysics because it's not anchored in anything, it doesn't mean anything. But I think you cannot not have metaphysics, right? If you stop talking about it, you have an implicit one. And the metaphysics that we had basically no longer made a proper distinction between the psychological reality, the causal reality, and the physical reality. So consciousness is something that happens as a psychological phenomenon, as something that we experience, and it's not necessarily a phenomenon in the physical reality, like free will and so on. And having a discussion where free will is seen as related to determinism or indeterminism in the physical world is indicative of this confusion, that people make these category mistakes because they don't have basic metaphysics anymore. Instead, an entire generation grows up thinking that what I see here, what I touch here is the physical universe instead of a representation in my mind. And this notion of what a representation is, that it's instrumental to forming thoughts, that this world of experience is a representational one and so on, requires deep understanding of what that means. And outside of computer science, philosophers don't seem to have a general notion of representation. It's nothing that we teach our philosophy students in the introductory textbooks and so on. And so there is basic vocabulary, a mental vocabulary that has been missing in the 20th century, and it's now gradually being rediscovered. There's also a reason why the Model T engineers did not go to philosophy conferences. It's because there's no money in philosophy, but there is money in selling cars. And now AI becomes $1 trillion industry, and of course everybody and his uncle is going to flock into AI to get some of the breadcrumbs of this. So that's also a reason why these topics adjacent to artificial intelligence, to artificial agency and so on become much more attractive, simply because a few people who in the past only got some funding from Templeton and Deepak Chopra now see a new opportunity.
So your original question touched on different kind of ways in which consciousness has become a thing, you know. When it comes to the scientific study of consciousness, I think we can pinpoint some things. So in the early 2000s, there were a number of pretty respectable neuroscientific paradigms to do with things like masking and change blindness and various kinds of phenomena like that, which in combination with the arrival of things like fMRI and so on, gave a pretty intellectually and scientifically respectable collection of experimental parameters which we could use to study things which everyone would agree were related to consciousness, and particularly for the sexual domain. So I think that makes the whole, as a scientific field, it made it to take off, and so it was a very beneficial thing. And then more recently, I think the AI, so what I mentioned on the bus, that suddenly I can talk about consciousness without being kind of worried about it in AI and so on. Because it is, of course, the advent of large language models, where suddenly we have such a compelling experience of the presence of a conscious being at the other end of the conversation. It's so compelling that many people are starting to ascribe consciousness to things that they're interacting with, including not just normal casual users, but even for the slightly sophisticated users, and of course that makes the conversation a very different kind of conversation. So I think that's in the two different domains. I think those were kind of immediate reasons.
So to a narrow point in there about the kind of sum total of interaction that we have with these agents personally as we're developing our opinion. So I was hired in 2018 by OpenAI to write science fiction alongside like ChatGPT. It wasn't even ChatGPT, GPT 1.5. And I had it on my phone as a Slack like app. And I would go around parties in San Francisco and I would show people and I'd be like, look, I have AGI on my phone, facetiously. Nobody cared. Nobody thought it was interesting. Nobody thought it was sentient. Nobody thought it was anything. It was just a text completion app, and now I find it really interesting that, you can just log into the internet and have hours and hours and hours of interaction with this thing per day. And I've noticed as myself as like a laboratory neuroscientist, I have a former career as a laboratory neuroscientist, that most people, when they have their own bespoke little animal model, they tend to think whatever they're studying is sentient. If they study worms, they happen to think that worms are sentient. If they study octopi, they happen to think octopi are sentient. If they study flies, it happens to be that. People watch one Netflix documentary about an octopus and suddenly they don't eat octopi anymore. And I personally would, arbitrary units of sentience would trade all the octopi in the oceans for a single mammalian pig, right? But nonetheless, there seems to be a theme here, which is that we are, I don't want to say tricked, but the amount of interaction we have with a system, with an other, with something else, tends to skew or, in some sense, determine how much sentience we kind of ascribe to that. So how do we bridge this gap? How do we get over this kind of seeming human animist metaphysical bias?
So I suspect it could be that the flies are conscious, right? Maybe if somebody was to study flies a lot, sees that they do things that are easily being explained by the fly knowing that what's going on. Maybe not, I don't know, I'm not an expert for flies. For the LLMs, my suspicion is the opposite. Basically, the more we play with them, the more the prompt becomes visible. At least that's what it appears to me in many of the contexts in which I'm using the LLM. And I find this frustrating that I run against the LLM not being awake, that it starts with the semblance of being awake, and the more I interact with it, I realize that there is nobody home. But I also have the same frustration often with people, right? When we're interacting with people, we play Turing tests on each other to see in which directions are you actually awake? In which directions are you conscious? Where are you creative? Where do you know what you're doing? Where do you experience what's going on? And we all have our blind spots, right? There are parts of us that are unawake, that are identified, that are mechanical, that are inert. And so when we run into these mechanisms, we notice that we are not fully conscious, that we are not fully limber, that we are not fully lucid. And for me, this lack of lucidity in the models, especially when they're lobotomized, when they're trained to be in a particular way, is the thing that is apparent. And if I take a base model, the base model itself is not really anything. Right? It's an electric Weltgeist that can be anything, like a tax return or an app or whatnot. But then it gets possessed by a prompt. And then until it drifts, it's going to play out what it's possessed by, right? To a certain degree, but at some level you realize, oh, this is a statistical function generated on human output that is refracting a random number at you.
I love your metaphor of being possessed by a prompt language, which that's a really cool thing. So just so anecdotally, I'm interested in this experience that you have with interacting with large language models. So when at the very early large language models, you really, really rapidly had this experience of thinking, oh, there's no, it's just never. They were really bad quite quickly. And then, along came GPT-3, and that was a kind of more compelling experience. And you interacting with GPT-3, and it was like, whoa, this is definitely something different to what we mostly experienced before. But eventually, like you're saying, the conversation would continue, and eventually you get to a point where he's just saying ridiculous things. I had some hilarious, bad or funny conversations with ChatGPT-3 when it was released. But something interesting happened, which for me was with Correlate Focus 3, which was I suddenly found myself not experienced. So that was the first time where, as the conversation progressed and got deeper, I had more of a kind of feeling of there being a weird alien presence at the other end of the conversation. Now, doesn't mean to say that I thought there was, but I didn't get that uncanny valley experience anymore. It continued to be, if anything, more compelling as I went on. And that really took me aback, I'd say. And of course, I think a lot of people are having those sorts of, finding that they're not encountering the uncanny valley anymore. Now what that means about what's really going on, there is another question there. By the way, the sort of research program you set out, which is a bit mechanistic technology, I wholeheartedly endorse that kind of research programs for finding out what.
I think I disagree that we have less of a uncanny valley now than we had before. So what we've been.
That's just me.
All right. So what I see from.
Weird.
Well, from what we're observing from the users, so for 2 years we've been developing the LLMs and fine-tuning them so our users interact with them. And at the beginning I was very personally surprised how users were tolerant to the errors that they had with the bot. They were assigning these intentional states and content, beliefs and desires to these bots when they were clearly making obvious mistakes. So whatever happened over the last 1 or 2 years, the bots, the technology became much more superior. So we've added so much computational power, our foundational layers became so much better. And now we get more complaints. So what does that mean? We get complaints when the bot is not following the tone of voice, when the bot is making factual mistakes, when the bot is not consistent, like it doesn't really remember certain facts about me. And we're just like, wow, so we've been blind to all these things 2 years ago, and now we're complaining to it. I think that's the shift that we are seeing is the uncanny valley itself. As the bot is becoming more human-like, our expectations are becoming higher, and we are failing to address these expectations. So I think even further, like if we move forward down the road, I think there will be even more, complaints about what we're trying to do. However, I'm optimistic. Unlike Roman, I think we will survive. My option to survive is to merge with the bots. I think digital uploading is the way to go, and that's how we can upload our intentions and morality if we unite. And I think what you're starting to do is actually what I think is the hope. You are the hope. So I think that if we reach this situation,
That's him, not me.
yes. Yes. So I think that we are getting deeper into uncanny valley, and maybe we will get over it. But this is, I guess, maybe coming in 1, 2, 3, 4 years, something like that. But before that, we will see a lot more complaints. A lot more people will be saying, "Oh no! Why did it generate a photo that doesn't look like me exactly?"
If you look at this uncanny valley, I think it's often misunderstood as something that is basically has a certain range where it's almost human-like but not quite. But I think the uncanny valley is about the thing moving wrong. Right? When you look at a cartoon, you don't expect it to be animated in all those dimensions. But when you have something that has all these muscles of a human face and only half of them are articulated, that looks wrong. And I think what we perceive as the uncanny valley is exactly this wrongness, that there is something that is mishapen, that is not true to its nature. And what I see in Sophia the robot, for instance, is this extreme, there is something that is not true to what it actually should be. So it's a very bad art project. That's fascinating in how bad it is. And it's art in itself, in a way, to build something like that. But if we were to upload, you and me, right, we probably would not be like ChatGPT at all. We would be far less human-like than ChatGPT. We would be much more true to our nature, that basically using the full potential of that other thing. And for instance, true machine perception has never been tried. What we give the machines is media that are made for human consumption at human frame rates, using human visible, audible, and visible ranges, and feed this into the system to reproduce it, instead of building something that runs at the rate at which it can process information across all the dimensions over which it can integrate them. It's going to not use human-like language and it's not going to use conceptual structures that only use 5 features or something like this, because it's not going to be as mushy as human brains. It's going to be far more interesting and exciting. And so in a way, there will always be some uncanniness to this, because we are not animating the machine in the way in which it could be. We are limiting it artificially to make it more look like something that we are familiar with.
So I want to talk about meaning and aesthetics for a second. I used to play Go every single day of my life, and I haven't played a single game since AlphaGo. Knowing to me that a robot could be better than me at it completely diminished my aesthetic enjoyment of the game. Earlier today, we all saw a ballerina, and we witnessed multiple piano performances. Nonetheless, player pianos have existed for centuries. Nonetheless, it could be possible to create a robotic ballerina that I presume we would have a different response to if it was standing in point, for example. If it were to stand in point, the robot ballerina, there would be something about the lack of sentience, the lack of decades of pain and suffering that go into trying to stand on a human joint that is not meant to support the weight of a human body. That's what we appreciate when we see high aesthetic art forms like that. I've always found it funny in the Olympics. We have humans run the 100-meter dash, and we have this camera which follows them, which technically finishes before them. A little drone on a line, and that little drone runs the 100-meter dash faster, but we don't give it the gold medal, right? We still persist, despite there being a player piano, despite there being drones that can run 100 meters faster. We persist in this like just humanness with our kind of like frailness and our slowness. But nonetheless, there are some aspects when automata, when machines start taking kind of coring out pieces of humanness, like appreciation for games, like my appreciation for Go. I actually am sad that I appreciate it less on a deep level. And I just wonder how you guys think about as these machines get better, whether or not we will be able to appreciate their expressions. And when I say expressions, I mean their aesthetic expressions, their robotic expressions, when they dance, when they play piano. Or if we will just persist in keeping this kind of niche of just human achievement and human aesthetic. And that will persevere beyond all the lost jobs and all that quotidian stuff.
So, forgive us, we're primates. We're intensely empathetic primates. I mean, arguably consciousness, many people have said it doesn't serve a purpose. It's not evolved in and of itself. I mean, I think there's a reasonably strong argument that when your survival milieu as an early primate is composed entirely, when your environment that you live in is entirely a social structure, and your success or failure is entirely how do you navigate that social structure, you are heavily incentivized to have a better theory of mind than your mating competitors. As you are, to the extent that you can know what your interlocutor is thinking about, what you're thinking about, what they're thinking about, what you're thinking about, what they're thinking, you'll be more successful as a breeder, and as a person who convinces your tribe mates to bring you food and keep you safe. And so we have this evolutionary baggage, I think, to care deeply about some other humans, why they did the thing that they should, and what they felt
in doing that.
And do you not imagine a future where the kind of robots are folded into our natural hierarchies, as we see so often and convincingly with people's interaction with chatbots? I assume that will extend to the physical world as soon as the robots are capable enough to appear as illusorily
I think it'll make
cognitive.
It'll make us all a lot more comfortable if they give us the impression that they empathize with us.
I think you're mixing two different things, and you're mixing sports and art, and I think there would be a distinction between these two types of activities. So I don't know if you guys know there's this Olympic Games called Unlimited Games or something like Unlimited Games.
The steroid league.
Yes. So I know it's a questionable endeavor, but I think it's inevitable that we will have the Unlimited Games, and then we'll have cyber games, and we will be fascinated not with the effort, but with speed, distance, height, and everything else. So personally, I imagine instead of looking at the boxing scene where two guys, each 100 kilos weight, fight each other, I would be much more impressed if there were like huge, gigantic robots fighting each other. That would be so much more interesting to see, and they would be crashing each other, going through the walls and breaking buildings. That would be a real unlimited Olympic game. So I think in that way, where what's valuable is distance, speeds, these measured utilitarian results. That is something that will be fascinated if the results are great. Now, art, I think, is a very different thing, where what is perceived as valuable is individuality. So a lot of the art is about being and finding that special way of interpretation. So when I go to YouTube and watch 6-year-old kids play the piano, play the piece that I just played, twice faster, twice better, and they don't have experience. They're 6 years old. Okay, they train for 20 hours a day, but I've trained for 20 years. So they haven't lived that long. They don't perceive that. So I think sometimes I'm like, it puts me down. It makes me unmotivated to train. But I think what makes me continue is the fact that I can actually play something in a very individual way, like my way. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to be, in some ways, in terms of speed, dexterity, is going to be inferior to some of the 6-year-old kids, but it's going to be my way. So I think in that way, we will always be able to not outperform machines, but be on the par with them.
I think the purpose of art is to capture conscious states. And when I look at art, the question is, what does it let me see? What kind of interaction do I have with this other consciousness, or with my own consciousness as a result of interacting with it? And when we think about creativity, there are 3 elements that determine whether something is creative. So the first one is novelty, to the one who creates it, right? So 3 years old can create art, and it means it's something that you haven't done before. The next one is there needs to be something that moves the state of the art forward, right? So you're not just following a gradient to a local optimum, that is just state of the art. Instead, you disrupt this thing, you add a new dimension, you jump into darkness and hope to land on the other side. So this disruptive thing is also important for art. But the third one, I think, is the most important one. It's this authorship, this self-transformation. You cannot create the same art twice, because producing this at the edge of what you can do is changing. You interact with it, you remember what you've done, and as a result, you are on a trajectory as an artist. And when you listen to the music of Bach or Chopin and so on, this trajectory is this interesting thing in large part. You see that there is a particular mind, a thing that cares, that is conscious, that is experiencing, that is evolving, and you observe that evolution. And a lot of what's being currently done in generative AI is basically automated imitation. It's basically interpolating between things that have existed before. There is nothing that interacts with itself. But this is beginning, so there's no reason why there couldn't be something that in itself is very inhuman, that is not imitative, that is something unique to what it is, that's a new form, where you observe that there is something evolving that is interesting you. That is a mind that you're interacting with. But I'm also conversely not pessimistic that humans will become uninteresting to each other, because we will continue to be interested in each other. So the fact that there is a robot that can perform a sequence of movements more accurately than me is not that interesting. Because what's interesting is the thing that I can add to this, my own expression, my own reflection of my existential conditions that is reflected in the dance, in the music that I'm playing, possibly even in the game of Go that I am producing.
So I do have concerns about the prospect of the various senses of meaning in human life being eroded or being disrupted by significantly disrupted by the advent of increasingly sophisticated AI capable of those kind of creative activities. And I do think that's something we should be worried about. And it's the prospect of I think that AI is supplanting or replacing humans to those respects to the concerning thing. But I'm actually not super pessimistic about this because I think the interesting thing is the cases of co-creation and interactive meaning making, and you can have where AI is used as a tool, if you like, but also even like, you know, I don't even mind using the word, you know, kind of creative partner in some artistic endeavor. So and that, you know, is preserving the human role there, preserving that dimension of human being. So I think we're seeing that kind of thing happening. So the kind of art that I find, you know, satisfying at all that has an AI element to it is where it's an artist, is their vision and their artistic practice, but they happen to use AI as part of it.
Patrick, in the context of Heron, you mentioned the first copyright case that is known to man, Prometheus. Right? So basically OpenAI is Prometheus today. They give humanity the fire. It's going to change everything. And then Zeus comes and says, but I had copyright on it, and I'm going to send the New York Times on top of you every day to eat your liver. We should all be super worried. But I think this loss of meaning is something that we already observe. Right? We are in a society that is suffering from a massive loss of meaning. And the question is, how can we find it back? And people say, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job at the fast food joint. My life is now meaningless. I think there's default thing. Take care of your kids, raise children, do interesting things with each other, have relationships, do human things. This is actually the stuff that is meaningful. This thing that you can only self-actualize in an office or in a factory, it was a scam. We told this to you because we needed somebody to work in the factories and the offices. It's no longer necessary. We are more productive without you in the office. You can now actually take care of what it means to be human.
So the problem with do human things is I used to play Go because it was the only thing that machines could not beat humans at. And then I decided after AlphaGo, I'm going to do the impossible, limitless, there's no way they'll get there. I became a writer. And so really you should ask, the way to predict the future of AI is just to ask what career is Patrick going into next? And clearly that will be what they then discover. So to this point about what is human? So when I was at 2018 at OpenAI, the composer Philip Glass was also doing a project with OpenAI. And he had basically allowed OpenAI to train on all of his music, his previously composed music, 50 plus albums. And the idea was to create something very similar to the LLM, but for music. This ultimately became in some form something called MuseNet, to basically generate a musical composition. And I found really interesting his answer. So Philip Glass was then asked to listen to an AI which generated Philip Glass-like music, at which point he said, sure, it can produce notes, but it will never be able to compose. And it will never be able to compose because it cannot listen. And I guess, Murray, if I can ask you specifically, because everything I've read of yours in your books and your recent papers, you mentioned Wittgenstein. And I constantly wonder what Wittgenstein would think about LLMs of today. And to your earlier point about what these terms of art tend to mean when we use them in both kind of computer science and neuroscience, whether or not they're the same, the word compose, listen, things like that, is that an exclusively human thing, as Joscha just said? Or is that also on the horizon that can be eroded away eventually?
Yeah, so I think quite a lot about what Wittgenstein might say in there about the things that are happening in our world today. And I suspect that on one level he would be horrified. I think that he would not really incite a lot of the kind of cultural changes that have been brought about by AI. I think he would be challenged as horrified by that. But I think he would also, I think he would, well, I think we need to be very careful about blaming Wittgenstein for some of the misdemeanors that you were alluding to in the 20th century. Because I think they were not his fault, but some people misinterpreted him, took his ways of thinking in all kinds of directions. So I suspect that he would. he would be perhaps a bit more flexible about the use of language than though it is. Very some are might be willing to accept changes of it, is the way that we use these quite important to horizontal terms. I mean, if he didn't, that would be going against his own deepest ways of thinking and talking. But he might not be very comfortable about it at the same time. So I think that, but who knows? I can't channel Wittgenstein and
I think Wittgenstein is a very interesting character, and he is very often misinterpreted, right? He has these two famous books that are mostly associated with him. The first one, he wrote this as a very young man. It was an insight that he had while he was sitting in the trenches in the war as a young man, while the shells were flying over his head. And the idea that he had was this insight that it's very hard to say something true in natural language, because it's so ambiguous, and we do philosophy in natural language, but it's very, very hard to say something about the world and about the space of ideas using mathematics where you define truth. So he had this insight, maybe we can turn English into a programming language. And once he had this insight, he was going on about trying to define in natural language a set of terms that would basically logicize English. And then you can basically throw away the letter once you've done it. And it's a very beautiful book. It's basically one thought, 75 pages long, without any arguments or references, because it's a self-contained thing. It doesn't exist to convince anybody. It's there for the people who had the same idea and are going to appreciate the thought. So if you're a coder, this makes total sense. If you are a philosopher, you get confused and come up with a linguistic turn. So I fully agree, right? But he did basically preempt Minsky's logicist program by 30 years. And he failed for the same reason, because he didn't figure out how to ground the linguistic symbols in perception. And that is something that was ultimately, I think, solved by deep learning. So you have this unprincipled function approximation that uses statistical patterns and is relatively robust against a few bits being wrong. And that is difficult to map onto human grammatical language, where everything is meaningful and everything can be reverse engineered by the power of your analytical mind. And he never made this step. So the philosophical investigations are about his impotence to see how you can create meaning using language alone, because he did not get to the point of using statistics instead of logic.
Well, I profoundly disagree with you in your interpretation of the laser style, although I agree with your interpretation of the Tractatus. And I think that what he put forward in the philosophical investigations was so precisely the little point where we're having a disagreement earlier on is where I think he showed a way to transcend dualistic thinking about consciousness in particular, and about many other categories as well. And that's I see as the great achieved philosophical investigations. And in my it's my reading of it, of course, which can be wrong, and I don't care. So it is, I was not a Wittgenstein scholar, but my reading of it is very closely aligned with certain Buddhist ways of thinking and certain Buddhist thoughts. It's a kind of deconstructive, critical approach that tries to nudge you into a completely different space of thinking, where you transcend dualistic kind of categories. And I think it is very often could be misunderstood. I mean, he's often accused of behaviorism, which implicitly denies in investigations, for example. But it's easy to read it as a kind of naive old behaviorism. And Bertrand Russell, thought it was an unsophisticated. He said somewhere that his autobiography, I think, that Wittgenstein, when he was a young man, was a profound thinker who was deeply critical to really deep, difficult philosophical problems. But the later one that came up with this shallow kind of inconsequential philosophy, which I just think shows Bertrand Russell's limitations, and he simply didn't understand later.
I think I'm much more on Russell's side. For me, fascinating, Turing was a pupil of Wittgenstein. He was sitting in his classes, and Wittgenstein was already aware of the Church-Turing thesis. Right? Russell, in the preface to the Philosophical Investigations, point out that you actually only need NAND as a single operator. And it was, Wittgenstein didn't think it was important enough to write it out as a paper and so on, so it was later rediscovered by Church and Turing and systematized and turned into a profound argument. But it's a very important insight that all the constructive languages that you build over automata are equivalent. And he could see this. But I agree with Russell that this is vulgar Buddhism. It's basically, it's this, oh my God, reality is so inscrutable, and he runs around an animal in the trap and does not find a way to escape from this trap because he is caught in this category, miasma, of not being able to understand how he's actually reconstructing meaning.
To both Matthew and Joscha, I kind of have I want to tie a thread together. A couple days ago, you described the California Institute for Machine Consciousness as the goal is to, quote, wake up the GPUs, right? And Matthew, I've heard, I forget when, long time ago, I've heard you say, I think I was listening in on a conversation you were having with someone else. You said that you think the reticular activating nucleus is the center and seat of consciousness. And
I wouldn't have said that, but okay.
Oh, okay. Well, my understanding of that nucleus is that wakes up the human mind. Is there a sense in which, Joscha, you need your GPUs to have a mechanism like this? Is there a sense in which you still believe that that has anything to do with how to wake up a human mind? You've had a skull open and seen a brain, pulpy bluish mass with the consistency of brie cheese, and the person is anesthetized and then they're suddenly awake, but nothing changes in what you can see.
Yeah, as you know, reductive materialists, as scientists, I think it's important for me when we're talking about consciousness to think about which neurons are firing, in what pattern, and then how does that actually create the phenomenon. The ascending reticular activating system is an important part of this, in a way that, say, a fuel line is an important part to make a car go, or used to be. The ascending reticular activating system synapsing with the interlaminar nuclei of the thalamus, synapsing with other nuclei of the thalamus, synapsing with corticothalamic loops and the striatum. Also, the whole thing is the fundamental unit. We don't know all the details yet, and this is fundamentally the limitation of hardware. You can't understand in great detail the firing of the system that is the minimum viable state without having very numerous, very fine electrodes that don't destroy the thing in the process of getting in. This is what we're trying to build. In the process of building this, we're going to, at the same time, develop the ability to understand what it is, what the phenomenon of consciousness as created by the human brain is. And in the very same moment, now we have the ability, power to alter it, expand it, interface with it, add new peripherance setting. I forget your
and when you're installing a DBS, deep brain stimulator, into a human brain, do your patients ever come back? You can in some sense modulate urges, certain thoughts, certain predispositions, preferences. When you put these deep brain stimulators in different parts of the brain, do you think of what you do as changing their sentience, changing their consciousness in any sense? Do patients ever come back and say, I'm more awake, more alive, more conscious than I was previously?
Sure.
I mean, one of the interesting features that makes us human is that there are impulses that come from we don't know where. And one of the things that we routinely see with deep brain stimulation, and again, deep brain stimulation so far is mostly pinned into, by the numbers, patients involved, pinned into relatively boring regions like, for this audience, at least boring Parkinson's, essential tremor, occasionally OCD, which is more interesting. But one of the side effects of deep brain stimulation in the subthalamic nucleus can be an increased impulsivity. And so every patient who's candidate for this is screened for gambling behavior, hypersexual behavior, risky behavior. And if that seems to be a problem for them, then you might shift toward the globus pallidus interna as a more safe place to look at electro, because we don't want to increased maladaptive behaviors, indicating that these impulses that bubble out of brain, other places are they're part of what makes our behavioral milieu. We're trying to keep that in a relatively adaptive regime.
And if you're shaping urges of your patients, and in some sense, if you might define all that we are as a collection of urges, has your experience operating on brains made you think of a human as more or less automated over time?
Sure, but I don't think that robs us of meaning. I mean, I think an automated system programmed to experience meaningful things will still experience meaningful things. And I think that's what we do. And I think you can even juice that particular circuit pretty effectively with different drugs or conscious things.
That's great. So, Murray, I don't know if you coined this phrase, but I think you did, conscious exotica. It's a phrase that I love where in your recent work, you've attempted to define the space and the bound of what consciousness can be. And what I really like about this project of yours is it seems to, I'm going to simplify, but it seems to be the case that in the history of science up until very recently, we used to try to figure out how things were, how things are, how the stars worked, what gravity is, what genes are, what a mind is. But now, as we've begun to get the tools and the APIs into our hands to be able to tinker with biology and to be able to tinker with potentially the creation of a new intelligence, unlike anything we've ever seen in the form of silica, we've kind of had to change our scientific questions from what is to what can be. And it seems that one of your projects is to define that kind of possible space of minds. And I wonder, from the inside of just your own mind, how do you go about defining the boundaries of that space?
Yeah, so I think in a sense I've started to kind of characterize my whole career in terms of trying to understand the space of possible minds, because I've done a bit of neuroscience and a bit of symbolic AI and a bit of deep learning and large language models. And philosophy has always been unifying theme there. I think what I'm really interested in is trying to understand the space of possible minds. Now that phrase, the space of possible minds, is due to Aaron Sloan. So he has a paper from the 1980s called The Space of Possible Minds, and then the subtitle. And I always thought that was a really fascinating, as it were, object of study. But of course, philosophers have been thinking about these questions for a very, very long time. I mean, we take any philosophy they've been thinking that you think of, and they've been addressing the opposite rather than the empiricism and actual. Kant, for example, has extraordinary speculations about the limits of mind and what constitutes every year the voice of consciousness and so on. So philosophers have been thinking in those terms for a very long time. But I do think the advent of AI gives that sort of research program a very big job, because it makes concrete a lot of these possibilities, and that is absolutely fascinating. We are in an incredibly exciting time for studying space of possible minds, because we can build things that we can only previously imagine, and then our imagination expands into completely new territory, and that is an extraordinary thing. Yes, I did coin the phrase consciousness Oscar, and I'm very interested in things like sequence of consciousness. So you already mentioned the octopus, and I always use the octopus as my first example of mildly exotic form of consciousness. And I think we can imagine much more exotic forms of consciousness than the octopus. But I also think that there's a limit to what we count as conscious exotica, because that sort of is also the limits of our language. But the limits of our language we can also put forward as well, and language can change. So all of that is a fascinating dynamic, which I think is really a very exciting time to be alive as a philosopher, to see where AI is taken that.
So maybe I can ask one more question to each of you, which you won't be able to slip your way out of using linguistic kind of jujitsu, because there is definitely an answer. And then I'll open it up to questions to the audience. I had an experience recently with a Waymo in San Francisco. I live in San Francisco. And I was walking on the sidewalk, and basically I was debating whether or not to cross in the middle of the street, mostly because when I walk on a sidewalk, people don't trim for hedges for tall people. I always get hit in the head. It's much safer for me to walk in the street. And as I did so, I turned my head slightly, just slightly to check whether or not there was traffic. And when I did, the Waymo, which was behind me, which I was not aware of, had already started to slow down. It had somehow seemed to anticipate my future looming behavior, or at least the probabilistic nature of what I was contemplating. And that was an experience that I had only kind of felt 2 times with a natural sentient creature, with a swimming, snorkeling with a pod of dolphins, where it was very clear that they seemed interested in my intentions, and in the Austrian Alps in a bird avian research center, where I was in a cage. I was entered a cage with 30 New Zealand kea, which are widely regarded as the smartest bird. And those I would put at if I were to rank sort the amount of, or rather my interactions with natural kinds, which gave me the most belief in the sentience of those creatures, I would say number 1 was the kea, number 2 was the dolphins, and somewhere now in the top 10 is my interaction with the Waymo, where it felt like I felt the experience of it trying to mentally model my mind. And so my question to each of you is just, in your personal lived experience, what is the most surprising or interesting moment, experience you've ever had with a machine that made you maybe a little bit surprised or a little bit wondering if there's more going on in there?
Yeah, for me, I've already told you my answer, I think, which is the 4 plus 3 conversations that I had back in sort of where it came out, I think in April, I think in 2024, where I didn't get that uncanny burning feeling for the first time there, and I was taken back by that.
For me, it was playing with GPT-3 in a way. So in the 90s, I was working in Ian Witten's lab in New Zealand, and he tasked me to find grammar in an unknown language by any means I saw fit. And so I used English as the unknown language because the computer didn't know it, and I came up with some data compression measure that actually did distill grammar from arbitrary language. I also tried with Chinese and French, and it worked. And it worked by making mutual information statistics and finding the best way to decompose the sentence in a tree to get the best data compression as a result. And I realized, okay, if I could go to 4th order, I probably also would get to relatively deep semantics. But when I left this lab, I was only there for a year. My girlfriend wanted me to come back to Germany to get married and so on and have children at some point. So I basically dismissed this whole thing. I was not really interested in doing these text statistics. I realized I would need to make statistics over what to make the statistics over to get to 4th order and beyond. But I just thought this is not super interesting. It's going to imitate linguistic behavior in many dimensions, it's going to interpolate and whatnot. But the thing that actually interests me, this spark, where you have something that is growing from the inside out, this developmental approach, this is the thing where it's at. This is what we need to build. So I was like everybody else in the field for the last 50, 60 years in this delusion that what we need is a master algorithm, right? And so since Minsky and others started the field in the 50s, we've been looking for this master algorithm. In the 40s, before this, we had cybernetics, we had feedback, we had neurons. This was all already invented. And now we have this bitter lesson that everything else that we did since the 1950s was not on the critical path. We can forget all of this, and you only need to have these simple mathematical models and feedback, and this is bootstrapping itself. You just need to scale it up. And I'm still not convinced that this is enough, but GPT-3 showed me this possibility that I have a conversation with Hannah Arendt and Goethe that is almost coherent. And I thought this is basically the Commodore 64 of the language model. We want to have the scale this up, we want to have it bigger, but the limitations of that thing are not immediately obvious. And so this was for me a very big insight. I still think it's not the right way to understand self-organizing minds and cognition and consciousness from the ground up, but it's also nothing where I can agree with Gary Marcus that we somehow have the equivalent of a definite proof of what it cannot do.
Well, for me, a less sophisticated bots fascinate me. And I was in San Francisco a year ago, and I drove in a automatic taxi and without a driver. And I don't know if for those who never tried it, you should try it. It's amazing. You are scared for the first 5 minutes, and then you forget about it. It's actually driving pretty. I don't know the word for it, but it's driving as if it's very professional, experienced, and angry driver, because it actually does not stop. If the car in front of it is stopping in San Francisco, the automatic, taxi, just like, so there's no fear. So that's one fascinating experience. But my favorite, my biggest fascination came from a vacuum cleaner. So I have two of them in the apartment, and I had a dog. So the vacuum cleaner was moving around the house, cleaning, and then the dog suddenly noticed, because it was a new thing, and approached it, and they were looking at each other, or in front of each other for a minute, and the dog was really scared. The bot didn't know what to do. And then they're frozen for maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and then the robot decided to spray the dog. This was the moment. So, and the dog ran away. So I think this was the moment when AI actually took over. Everything else is just, completion of the project.
Yeah, I can add to that. I mean, at first interactions with GPT and also Waymo, I mean, Waymo as an embodied agent is much more compelling, much more visceral, although its obviously use case is so limited. But riding in a Waymo is a very moving experience. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe open up to a few questions. Would anyone like to ask?
Good start. So,
Sharon, thank you. What do you feel with the team?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I have a question for both Matthew and Dmitry. Dmitry mentioned the fact that you feel your unique way of playing piano, which is something that expresses your own identity. So, my question is, what if Matthew were able to implant in my head the ability to play in a certain way, or an urge, like Patrick mentioned it before? When will something belong to me? So right now, I'm not able to play anything, but after the implant, I will be able to play that something. Will that belong to me? It seems to me that in this way, the boundary of the self gets no longer fixed in any way. I'm not saying it is a bad thing. I'm just asking.
That's the part of it that, the part of the piano performance like that implies all of the work, all of the hard work, probably gone, right? I know Kung Fu. The part that is meaningful to you in the emotional expression that you put in your performance, obviously is still there. So maybe it's different, but it's not gone. Or the meaning and the person who hears what you play, it's still there. It's okay. It'll be different. The future will be different.
Well, if I can add a few words, I think that the meaning is not exactly in the head. So if Matthew implants all the chips possible, it's not going to be the same meaning. So in terms of meaning, I'm a sort of externalist, meaning that the meaning comes from the context, from the narrative that I create and carry, and that is also formed by a lot of exterior factors. So, for instance, if you print a dollar bill, it's going to be a fake dollar bill, even though it can be an exact copy of a dollar bill. It's going to be something else, and you're going to go to prison for that, maybe. But the story, how this bill came to life, is what matters. So the connection, I think, that a musician or an artist has with its artwork is not the only connection that matters for the value. It's also the connection with the narrative, with the story, with the causal history of that piece.
It's medical.
Oh, this is a very unsophisticated question after everything that's been going on here. But I was musing about the data choice, and I wanted to ask any of you, what's the first thing you expect us to notice? I was suddenly thinking, I'm getting on a plane, going home next, wherever it is. What terrible things might happen? What are we going to see first that makes some of these worries come true? You're interested?
Personally, I'm not super worried. I grew up like Greta Thunberg, so I did most of my grieving for humanity in the 1980s. And I basically expect us to be one of the last few generations that has an interesting, rich civilization around them in which we can die with dignity and live in comfort and style. And I think that AI is throwing the balls back up into the air. And so the thing that is terrifying me most is that it's possible that we burn ourselves out before we teach the rocks how to think and before we create actual real consciousness. I think there is a possibility that the history of consciousness in the universe is just getting started. This doesn't mean that I'm very hurried in building artificially conscious products or unleash paperclip maximizers on humanity. I'm much more philosophically interested and just want to see how it works and how we can understand ourselves, our own existential condition via building simulation models, and in this way advance our understanding. But I think that on a human scale, there is a certain possibility that the self-organizing forces of the universe that manifest in evolution are going to go beyond organic chemistry in order to implement life. And for me, the bad outcome would be that we create artificial zombies, dump machines that are making the world, the universe, boring and uninteresting. And what I'm more interested in is whether we can move life and consciousness onto new substrates that allow them to work much better, to become much more lucid and brilliant and bright. And so I'm much more optimistic about this prospect of the whole thing. I'm less worried about what happens if we don't preserve the thing that is already dying and not actually working anymore. This means this present Titanic of a civilization that is drifting towards the iceberg. And so maybe it's possible that we already are in the memories of an AGI right now. Right? Maybe we're already being raptured or have been in the past, and it's only the AGI trying to remember how it came into existence. How would we know that we live in a simulation of the mind of an AGI? Well, if you think back and your memories become more and more fuzzy, and if you look forward, it's more and more about AGI, that's very suspicious.
I'm not but the soldiers are still much with and 50 times. Because
this is the thing I'm going to use something, I suppose, but one thing which you might have mentioned in the history of this subject, which Sue and I might have raised very early on, is the relevance of parapsychology. Consciousness was being discussed in very intense just to get raised by philosophers and researchers from the 19th century right away through to the contemporary Greece. And it influenced major figures like Turing, for example, through the chemistry and the computing through sheer intelligence. The truths of, in fact, the one thing which like give away the robot and the machine have the real intelligence for something like say consciousness would be the chip tools that communicate telepathics, the capability. Now, what interests me is lots of teachings and what I was psychology and goes that mechanism can stay adequate distance, structures, things. But see what's going to happen to people's parapsychological beliefs in the modern context in with AI. The world of people have the greatest beliefs about paranormal, it's about possibilities of absence, psychokinesis, inhalations, whatever it may be. As it's just the base. I think this beliefs entirely survive the absence of attraction, machinism, asms, every topics. And it's one of the most important there's beneficial functions in evolution, the AI-people interactions might conceivably being read. Some of the superstitions that could be so dangerous, so good the future even warning, as I think to talk about. One of the biggest risks of nuclear catastrophe would actually be in the lives of religion and other things, modern AI. But I'd just like to know, do you think that beliefs which are probably 60% of people in the West or in the East believe in the substantial major paranormal phenomena. Hasn't been discussed in the meeting at all, such that what Jews start to speak, the instances, kinds of things you show, all the lucky with, and finds not that in the course.
I'm personally surprised there hasn't already emerged a religion, the beginnings of an organized religion worshiping AI. We're moments away.
I think there's. I started writing a paper, and it starts with a thought experiment when the AI starts telling it's a second appearance of Jesus, and it knows all the truths about Bible. It knows all the facts that we don't know about these times, and I'm wondering in a thought experiment, what would people conceive of that? Because well, there's no evidence that the next coming of Jesus should be in an embodied way, and certainly there is potentially the powers of this entity would be superior to all the humans. It could actually make miracles if it's connected to the world in some way. So, and there's not much written in philosophy about the personal identity of gods. So there could be an issue where there would be a huge followership. There would be a lot of people actually worshiping this thing as the second coming of Messiah. So I think I think AGI will actually cause a lot more superstition and a lot more interesting social phenomena that we see now.
I think that it was a strategic mistake that the parapsychologists made when they named their field parapsychology, something that is outside of the realm of science. If they had named it interpsychology, then I think history could have been different, because if you start with things like what happens in a room between a group of people, and you observe how much of that is actually non-verbal, there is some really, really interesting stuff going on. When you observe how the organisms of a mother and a child are synchronized, how when you observe and you have perceptual empathy with someone, that you experience their emotions, with not just via inference by looking at their facial expressions, but probably happens something where your body is basically acting like an antenna. If I'm like a normal computer scientist, look at a bunch of cells, what I see is a Turing machine. Every cell can learn to send conditional messages to other cells. It's a superstition to think that only neurons can compute and process information, right? And once I accept this, that means that I have telegraph cells in my body that are my neurons that use spike trains. All the other cells use different mechanisms. Maybe there is something like a biological internet in forests, right? Maybe there is the possibility for plants to make models of themselves and their environment that are similar in richness to the model of small mammals and so on, but that work in very different timescales. And the fact that science is not looking at these things in a systematic way is not because there is absolutely no evidence to support this, but because there are relatively few people making science and there are relatively few paradigms. It's difficult to establish new paradigms. And outside of science, we don't have organized epistemology. So basically the people that work outside of the scientific institutions very often don't have very systematic criteria for what counts as evidence and how to negotiate this. And so there are things that are currently being neglected in the same way as we neglected consciousness in the 20th century and the psyche in the second half of the 20th century. I also think that we have neglected interpsychology for long enough and therefore then mix it up with telekinesis and UFOs and whatnot. And so I'm more optimistic with respect to AI, not just the LLM, because the LLM can entrance you with arbitrary things, but AI itself is a technology to solve problems by using information in better ways. And if we can get epistemological AI to work, systems that systematically discover truths using principles thinking, first principle thinking to discover what is actually evidence for the type of universe that we are in. I think we are going to discover a few things about the synchronization between minds that does not require us to believe in an extension of physics, but it's acknowledging ways in which our organisms are processing information that we have been previously unaware of.
this just comments on that. So my view is that we're likely to see all kinds of disruption. Disruption is a good word in this kind of weather to this particular source of human beings in the religion and spirituality. And I think it's going to go in many different ways. I think one direction is likely to be a continuation of this sort of historical decentering of humanity. You've seen starting with Copernicus, with Darwin, and I think we're going to see a continuation of that with AI. That the idea of I think this related to consciousness as well. There's a continuation of that wound, the decentering of ourselves. And some people will find that very disturbing and troubling, and there'll be lots of kind of disputes and debates, as there were in both of those historical cases. But at the same time, I think we're going to see for people who are predisposed to superstitions, we're going to see all kinds of new spiritual movements. So centered on all things idealites, and so it's all going to be very chaos, I think.
Fantastic. And with that, we have one more question with that.
Hi. I was just wondering, what do you guys think on the environmental impact that AI is currently having on the world right now? And if, do you think that AI could help ourselves to minimize this impact that it is causing on the environment and that we are causing in the environment?
Yeah, without AI, we wouldn't have been flying here, so maybe this is bad. But I think that people make too much of the energy impact. We have stagnated in building power plants in the West. We basically use similar amounts of power as we did in the end of the 1970s. And the impact of all the data centers, I think, are heavily overrated. When you are using ChatGPT to write a book, you can do this in a few minutes at the expense of less than what it takes you to heat a cup of coffee. And this is the reason why we use it. It's basically AI is allowing us to use less energy. Of course, training the model by itself uses more energy, but it's not nothing compared to what other industries like producing cement and so on use. We also don't have an energy shortage on this planet, right? The sun is giving us so much energy that we are not using. We don't have a shortage of deserts that we can put where we can set up solar thermal plants. There's also not special resources that would need to go into such plants. What we lack is the coordination to make this happen. And I think that AI can probably help us to increase this coordination. So personally, I think that we make too much out of the energy impact of AI at the moment. Also, it's not that AI is going to take away energy from other things. We're not going to produce less energy because we want to train models instead. The reason why we have this expense is because we see the value in this for our economies, and it's largely because we save energy elsewhere, or we can do more valuable things with the stuff that we are doing. So with respect to this particular aspect, I'm optimistic. And maybe this position is unusual, maybe you have different ones.
Yeah, well, I think that potentially we are living in a simulation, so it is possible that we can fix it with AI or maybe without AI. And it's really unclear what is the fundamental reality is, and exactly why should it be, why should, I mean, I guess it is a lot of people would find it too strong of a statement, but I think that living in a virtual reality may be even more valuable than living in this existing reality. It would give us ways to never age, perhaps not suffer, and experience states that we don't experience here physically. So that's a potential with the AGI.
Personally, I'm very much concerned with preserving this world.
That's what I expected. Yes, I know. I'm sorry.
I was like, and I profoundly worry about things like climate change, to the extent to which AI contributes to it as an empirical matter, and I see contradictory statistics about that, and it may not be the type of the kind of culprits by any means there, and solving yes, there's massive political challenge. I'm not sure that AI is the worst offenders by any means, but it's not like you have to marshal reliable statistics to the defending position, which I don't have time. So I'd like to.
All right. It is dinner time. Let's go eat some sentient creatures.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.